So hello everyone, welcome to SIG Auth for November 11th, 2020. I think the big discussion topic that we have on the agenda today is the future of pod security policy. I know we've discussed this a few times in the past, but we haven't actually come to any sort of definitive conclusions yet. Pod security policy is on a timeline at this point because of the no perma beta policy that went into effect. I think it was the last release, if I remember correctly, or I'm sure David can correct me. So I believe pod security policy is currently on track to be deprecated in 1.22 by default. That is sort of the if we do not take any action, pod security policy will go away. That's not a decision for it to go away, although that is a decision that we've discussed in the past. Yeah, so we do need to actually make a decision here. Otherwise, one will be made for us by default. So let me go ahead and share my screen. I tried to capture a few of the options that we've, the right one there. Is everyone looking at the future of pod security policy? Thanks. Let me make that a little bigger too. Yeah, so I tried to capture some of the things that we've discussed in the past. For people who are kind of newer to this conversation, let me just run through some of the problems with pod security policy as it exists today, like why we can't just say, okay, we're going to call this GA and go from there. The first is some problems with the authorization model. Pod security policy has this sort of dual overloaded authorization model where you can either authorize the requester to use a pod security policy, or you can authorize the object being created, in this case the pod, based on its service account to use the policy. And so this is confusing, and also if that pod happens to have create pod permissions, then you run into some problems there. The second issue is pod security policy is a global all or nothing policy in the cluster. So either you have pod security policy enabled or you don't. And if it's enabled, everything running in that cluster needs to be authorized by a pod security policy, and fails closed in the absence of a PSP. So this makes it essentially impossible to turn on by default, and which means that we're always lacking some test coverage, and users don't typically start with pod security policy enabled. And then because of the global nature of it, it's very difficult to roll out a pod security policy on an existing production cluster. And the third one that we've talked about in the past is the inconsistent and unbounded API that's sort of grown organically over time. The inconsistency is mostly kind of an aesthetic or ergonomic issue of the API. I think I see the kind of unclear scoping as a larger problem as we get requests for limiting various things. For example, finer grain controls on volumes. It's unclear whether that should go in pod security policy or a separate volume policy, and kind of where we draw the lines there. And then I added two new issues that we didn't discuss in the last SIG Auth PSP discussion, but pod security policy doesn't handle sidecars well. This is particularly an issue for when you have kind of auto-injected infrastructure sidecars that need a different set of permissions, such as the Istio sidecar, which requires, I think at one point it required capnet admin. Also unclear how ephemeral containers will work in here. And then the other one is there's not really a CI/CD story for pod security policy. So as users adopt more like GitOps workflows or workflows where they might want to verify that pods can run earlier in the pipeline, it's hard to do that because of the sort of stateful nature of pod security policy. So even if we were to build some sort of tool that could run admission controllers outside a cluster as part of a CI/CD pipeline, pod security policy isn't very effective for that. I see some chat, so I want to pause to leave room for if anyone has comments on what we've talked about so far. I see some discussion around sidecars and whether that's something that we actually want to care about here.
I mean, I see it as important, but I think that all the shortcomings you described with PSP stand either way.
Yeah.
And I think just to add, like, we just need to decide how we should be treating sidecars in terms of policies, and then try to make sure all the implementations follow that guidance.
I think I agree with you that it'd be good to provide some guidance, but maybe to David's point, I'm not sure that we need to decide that right here and now to block the PSP decision on that.
Yeah, definitely not a blocker.
I kind of feel like those two discussions need to go in the opposite order, because like whatever people shake out with sidecars, ultimately there's going to be a decision, are we wanting to allow this pod to run in the cluster or not? So as long as we have a general thing for deciding whether pods run in the cluster or not, it kind of feels like it should handle what people decide to do with sidecars. Except for the surprise factor where somebody injects a sidecar that causes your pod to get rejected when it otherwise wouldn't have. But mutating admission controllers are confusing.
Yeah, I mean,
by their nature.
The container model was not truly designed for anonymous injection of arbitrary content, and people are trying to use that way in sidecars. I kind of, like Derek's been trying to track that down. To solve sidecars as part of the API without addressing the security considerations would be a mistake, but that's part of sidecar as a general concept. Like, people are abusing init containers and other containers, hoping to get, you know, magic, and it's not going to provide a magic no matter how much they try that.
Maybe to give a couple concrete examples on that, I could see someone wanting a policy that says you're allowed to run with elevated permissions, but only in an init container. So not something that's kind of continuously running alongside production-facing workload. I could also see wanting to explicitly allow list certain signed containers where you know exactly what's running in there, and have additional constraints, maybe in the supply chain, up the supply chain, and so you've made the decision to allow elevated permissions on that sidecar.
And that a lot of that breaks down the moment you can control the command or the arguments, and then
or the exec or the attach.
Yeah. So and like one of the original sidecar or multi-container examples that we haven't gone back and addressed in 4 years because it's not going to work was, I want to run a daemon that does like a fuse driver in a sidecar, right? It's completely unrealistic with the security model of Kube to get any kind of security while you're doing that. It requires far too much. And in the meantime, we have created CSI and CNI, which for all their faults, mostly address those kinds of integrations in a different way. So it could just be that like secure sidecars are just not the right approach. Pod security policy shouldn't be blamed for that, but it is a key. It's important to note that it's happening, that people don't understand about what's going on. I like the point that webhook admission is hard because injection of anything that changes a pod without you understanding it, if it doesn't have a clean interface, is increasingly hard to understand how it will impact the workload.
I feel like this is getting more into implementation details of the kind of path forward that we choose. I think it's an important discussion to have before we actually execute on one of these. But I would like to move forward with talking about the really high level options for moving pod security policy forward. And then come back to this at a later time. So there's kind of 3 or maybe 3.5 options that we've discussed in the past for what to do with pod security policy. And just kind of really quickly, that's basically fix pod security policy, say, call it PSP v2 if you want, or v1 or whatever, but try and address some of these challenges that we just called out in the sort of existing, more or less, something that looks like what we have as PSP today. The second option is actually, let's go skip ahead to the third option. The third option is, say, we're not going to own this as kind of a core feature of Kubernetes. Instead, we provide admission webhooks, and there's a good, rich ecosystem of third-party policy controllers that are solving this problem in various ways. And you could even write your own pod security policy webhook if you desire. And the second option I see as kind of a intermediate between those two. The idea is that having some control over pod security settings is essential to baseline security in Kubernetes. And so let's provide the bare minimum to not have create or update pod be equivalent to root in the cluster. And for everything beyond that, then we say we offer third-party controllers. And then there's this sort of half option, which is the go with the third-party controllers, but sort of pick a winner as SIG Auth and say this is the option that we think should be the default for most customers needing a policy solution. So I can go through each of these in more detail, but maybe I'll open it up to everyone right now.
So it is worth noting that 3 is going to happen no matter what. And we have to support it anyway because we already have webhooks. So that's a good like there are third-party controllers out there that can do some aspects of this. Webhooks are hard. Some of the cons here have already happened or are a general problem with webhooks. That's at least one thing to recognize is 3 is going to happen no matter what. And I think we're successful if 3 is easier, but it may not be this group's responsibility. One of the cons on 2 that's not called out is we will continually have to negotiate the boundary for the baseline. And as security vulnerabilities and capabilities are introduced into the ecosystem, right? Like eBPF is pretty darn unsecure right now, unless you do a whole bunch of really limited things right. Someone's going to come to us and say, oh, I think I should have eBPF rights to load these modules. You know, so I'm making up things here, right? But like, we're going to have to negotiate that boundary. So definitely with 2, one of the cons is this going to be a long-term cost that we'll have to negotiate as a group with users and security policies. Doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do. It might actually be similar to what we already do in this project of we're trying to have a reasonable security posture out of the box and leave open the door for the right thing, but it is a cost that we should keep in mind.
I guess it's also worth noting that number 2, we presumably wouldn't be able to turn on by default for all the same reasons we can't turn on PSP by default.
I like that concern about number 2 and the different levels changing over time, because I like that kind of points the way towards implementing option 2 by using the tools of option 1. Add the like pod security policy binding, and then ship 3 or potentially more default pod security policies that correspond to those security baselines. And you could even go to the extent of shipping a default pod security policy binding in the default namespace to the one that corresponds to restricted, whatever the middle layer one is. But then in the future, as the definitions of what makes sense as baseline policies change, that entails updating the default pod security policies that are shipped. And it lets you turn it on by default in new installs, but also, lets people choose whatever they want just by modifying those bindings.
What Tabby said.
I think there might have been some misunderstanding about option 2. I read option 2 as we will not ship an API. We will not ship a default set of APIs. We will hard code 3 options into an admission plugin that will not be turned on by default.
I understood it that way also, which is why I was advocating for hybridizing it with 1.
Do we think we can select policies for option 2 that we wouldn't want to change or tweak in the future? I kind of look at the additional controls that got added to pods and then pod security policy around like no new capabilities, and like over time we kind of added more things when we realized that there were gaps. And it would really be unfortunate if our baseline or restricted policies turned out to not actually be baseline or restricted in the future because we couldn't compatibly take advantage of the new controls we had.
Yeah, so this is something I thought about when putting together the pod security standards that I was kind of imagining this being based on. The privileged policy never changes because that's always everything is allowed. The baseline policy tracks what is default in the pod. Restricted tracks best practices. Restricted is definitely going to change over time and would need to be versioned, I think.
Should we just do privileged and baseline? Because today, you can reasonably get away, like 99.9, there've been like just going through the numbers here, like if you set everything up right and done everything right, there've been like 2 vulnerabilities that would have slipped through in a reasonably well configured system on the baseline. And almost all of them, involves getting access to some level of volume. I do think the volume.
I'm going to disagree with that point. I mean, just earlier this year, we had the CapNet raw privilege escalation.
Yeah, that was blocked by SC Linux and OpenShift, right? Like what I'm saying is it's possible to imagine our baseline being secure today if you make a few trade-offs. I didn't mean it was perfectly secure.
But even SC Linux is not part of the baseline. Like a default pod doesn't have SC Linux enforcement. So
as a Heroku employee who also was not vulnerable to that at the time because we had blocked it, like that took work on our part. And I don't think we should assume that everybody's going to do that work, because clearly as a pen tester, not everybody is doing that work.
Well, and yeah, let me rephrase this. So Tim, your definition of baseline, let me tweak it in one slight dimension. What is baseline that works within the defaults to do something? And could you imagine a default imposed by a lower level that correctly bounds that? I can. There's a bunch of negotiation in it, and we'd have, the goal would be, is the goal that baseline runs all of the workloads? Like baseline will not run 100% of workloads on Kube today, so there's no magic here, right? Privileged is 100% of workloads. Baseline is something less than 100%. If it's a difference between 92, 93, and 94, we're going to take heat no matter where that lines up. If we move that 1% one way and we're able to get a recommended configuration that was significantly more secure within those bounds, I think that's probably achievable, regardless of like whether you should follow all the things, but we'd be setting a guideline for the community that would improve security across the board for all Kubernetes admins. And we would effectively say, look, if you have the escape hatch, the non-escape hatch is reasonably secure. Could we as a group get close to that? I think we could.
I mean, I think we have that already with the pod security standards document. We just don't give people an easy way of picking one, conforming their workload to it, and adopting it. And so if we shipped all 3 of those as options, then shipping the most restrictive one gives people something to aspire to and adds like 200 bytes of YAML to your install if you don't use it. And then making the one that's making the like baseline one be a default, still when people can't live within those bounds, they'll remove that and make their own policy and bind to it. But like having it there as something that they can agree or disagree with, but within Kubernetes, as opposed to depending on some particular Kubernetes distribution's choice of what are the lower layers under it, gives people encouragement.
I strongly agree with Tabby. And like every company I've worked at has asked for a defined set of policies, and usually a defined set of policies in the form of like low, medium, high, in terms of like the security level / paranoia level you want. And like, this is I've had different other places ask for that. Like that's a thing that people want and a thing that we aren't currently giving them. And I think it would make it easier for users to do the right thing. Because a lot of the time people are like, we want this and we don't actually know what to do. Please tell us what to do. And historically, the answer has been, well, do things granularly according to your needs and use case. And they're like, we don't know how to do that. Please tell us what to do. So I think having a way to do that,
if you don't know what to do, try this.
Yeah,
right.
Maybe I didn't, present this clearly, but I'm pretty convinced that there's something very close to baseline that just is secure by default. That's a little bit less restricted than restricted. Like I know there is, because it's possible to run like that. So I guess the question was, like we know that we'll struggle with some of these, but if we're making an arbitrary boundary for one default, that may be enough. Because again, what are we going for? Like someone picking restricted is a little bit more secure, but arguably many of those things are like heavily insecure options and very rarely used. So I'm not saying that we have to decide this now, but like at least in this is like the minimalist starter possibilities. We believe it's achievable to do it. We believe it's possible to get it. It's going to be a long-term cost. we should do it for all the reasons that were just mentioned, but the flexibility underneath it is still going to be our cost no matter how else we expose it. Are we optimizing for cost on our side? Are we optimizing for understandability by the community?
I do think we need to be realistic about cost and our ability and willingness to maintain it over time. I think PSP is a very good example of something that landed in a perma-beta status with known shortcomings that have been presented multiple times over the course of years and languished.
I think the implementation difficulties have a lot to do with that, because if people were using it, then what people's real world use cases were would naturally emerge, and then people would be asking for changes, and it would grow over time with the needs of the community. But because of these difficulties of actually putting it into practice, it remains kind of academic.
And I also think that, like, because we haven't actually historically been terribly forthcoming with like suggested lists of policies, it isn't that that cost isn't happening, it's that that cost is being offloaded to the people who are having to figure this out by trial and error. Yeah, which is a huge, huge widespread problem.
That's why I like this idea of like a hybrid option 2 by shipping pod security policies and a default binding, because it A, lets users agree or disagree with the, say, 3 default policies we ship, but also B, if they disagree, they can save the policy that we've shipped, make the one tweak that they disagree with, and load it back in with a different name and roll with it. So it still reduces their cost, whether they agree with us and use it, or if they disagree with us but use us as a starting point.
Second that.
One thing I like about that approach is that it sort of naturally bounds the API. So addressing that, whatever it was, third problem that I called out, in that we say, okay, you want to add a new option to pod security policy. Does that have a place in one of these 3 default policies? And if no, the answer is it probably shouldn't be added to pod security policy.
One challenge with that is that one challenge with leaving the API there, other than as a read-only kind of thing, is that if you change, like, we're going to have to test this in conformance no matter what. Like if we go to 2, this will be in conformance. It's not, there's no way that this could work without it. And that means you really can't change those. So the PSP API would have to be effectively immutable. And then you're talking about, maybe a variation of 1 and 2 by allowing people to add more policies. And I think that still comes, like, that still has all of the problems of the current mechanism without any of the advantages, because you're kind of heavily constraining what you can do with the defaults, and you have a less flexible mechanism than something like Gatekeeper or more custom built. Like, for instance, in the restricted set, like, most of those volume types really should, like, you just can't let people touch volumes. Would I rather tell people to use baseline and then come up with rules about how they could access those? But then we have CNI and CSI, which are both completely unbounded, and CNI local is going to need some better mechanism. We would have to go add that to pod security policy. That, like, right now, that's a Gavin pod security policy with the new CSI, like, local stuff. And you should be able to use it in some cases, but the control of that's going to depend on each CSI plugin, and you got to go do custom policy. That just doesn't scale with pod security policy today. So, like, the scalability of pod security policy as we add more concepts around, like, extension points, I think is pretty weak. So we would have to maintain that and then still have to go to option 3. So we'd be doing option 1, option 2, option 3, and maybe option 3B.
I disagree, because I feel like having security policy constraints around options that are added by a plugin is really on the plugin. And so as long as pod security policy covers everything that you can do in vanilla K8s without any additional, like, strange plugins, then I feel like that's the only scope that it needs to track. And it does still need to grow over time as the options within Kubernetes change. But if I start a storage startup tomorrow and I make a CSI plugin for it, that's not on anybody but me, I think, to be able to use my plugin securely.
Maybe I don't understand.
I think that there's,
you want the ability to add new policies effectively, I think, you'd like to preserve the ability to define new policies.
Okay, can I say a thing? I think that there is a fundamental disagreement underlying the crosstalking that we're doing right now that involves when people say the existing problems with combat security policies, that is in scare quotes, although you cannot see me, people are referring to different things. I think, Clayton, you're referring to the existence of the API, and I think Tabby and I are referring to the combination of the complexity and the confusion on the end user end about what exactly they're supposed to be doing, which currently is not really being suggested. And I think we're going to keep crosstalking until we actually address the fundamental sort of disagreement underlying all of this. Because we could do this all day.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of those. PSP and SCC both have all those today. They have all of those problems. People don't understand how to use PSP well. People don't understand how to use SCC well. People change them expecting that to fix their problem and break their clusters. So the flexibility comes with a cost. I thought that we were talking about reducing our cost as well with a better option.
I have a slightly more fundamental question, I think. Does pod security policy, because of its privileged status, is it able to do anything that a third-party policy controller can't do?
No.
It has one thing. It has one thing, which is that because it's burned into the API server, the pod that would be running the webhook for your enforcing thing can't wedge itself by being down and thus not being able to pass its own validation. Okay.
But that's not unique since you can specify a namespace selector.
I would argue that what is currently unique about pod security policy is that it ships with K8s. And as opposed to OPA or Gatekeeper or whatever, but you have to go out and get. And I would really, really, really not assume that all users are doing that, period, or that they are doing it well.
And one of the most political things you ever do in software is deciding what the upstream defaults are going to be, because people, even if they don't take them, look to them as the examples that they should agree or disagree with, which is why I don't like the Kubernetes has no opinion on this, use a third party option.
Strong agree. And because right now, like, users are just flailing and they don't fail to the most secure options, they fail to nothing.
I'm trying to understand here. I'm of the general opinion that SIG Auth does not have the bandwidth to make this go anywhere other than disappear. Right? That's my observation. Right? So
I agree with that observation.
Which is unfortunate. But to me, the reason that nothing happens and nothing gets better is because PSP exists. And people expect it to solve the problems, even though it is just a broken piece of software, right? And the sooner it dies, the sooner someone else can say they are the thing that is better, right? Like, we, as the maintainers of Kubernetes, have made it so that PSP is king because it exists in core, right? I'm willing to bet Gatekeeper, SCC, and various other things are better because they're actually significantly more complete. And I would rather walk away from this problem and give it to someone else who actually has the time to solve it in a more robust and complete way than continuing to go in circles.
I do want to point out that you're currently being tagged by the co-chairs of SIG Security, so this is not the only SIG around who has interest in this.
No, but if SIG, like, I'm okay handing it to SIG Security. You have 3 releases before we delete it. Please solve problem.
I agree with the second point, definitely, that, by building something into Kubernetes, we're sort of implicitly king-making here and hamstringing the third-party plugins. I'm not sure I agree that SIG Auth doesn't have the bandwidth to fix this problem. I think the problem is that we haven't been able to agree on what the right path forward is for pod security policy. I think if we chose one of these options and scoped pod security policy in a better way, and kind of addressed these more systematically, I do think that, like, we could make that happen.
Well, and maybe my other, and this is partially why I was kind of arguing against one, is pod security policy couples a number of discrete problems together, and the introduction of new things to Cube has made it more complicated rather than less. And so maybe there's an option 2A or 3C that is something along the lines, along the lines of the CSI storage, or making it the plugin responsibility that's a little bit more well scoped. So it deals with specific security problems. So one of them is escalation of the workload on the node. One of them is the ability to escalate which resources you have access to via arbitrary device plugin naming, right? Like you can ask for a PV that the cluster has access to and get access to it. And then potentially others which align with potential like network or capability related problems that aren't well defined. Breaking it up into 3 or 4 smaller problems with a good default for 1 or 2 of those problems might be more tractable.
Jordan, go.
Just wanted to mention a couple of things. Decomposing a policy problem into lots of little policies sounds attractive, and makes each individual problem smaller. But if the net effect is for a user that they then have to go set up 10 things and make sure 10 things are in place, I think we still want something that sort of says, like, stamp the recommended default in. And if it goes and does 10 things under the covers, maybe that's okay. But from a user perspective, like, turning one problem into 10 problems is not great. I tend to agree with Tim that if we could agree on the approach, I think there's actually bandwidth to do it. The main concern I have is that anything that's minimalistic and scoped, we know that people will want to layer on top of or extend or replace. And it's really hard to get a secure by default and disallow things you don't understand minimalist policy, which combines well with, like, layered on fancy policies. It's the ramp between the two is really tough. And so for option 2, if we had something to take the CSI plugin example you had, Clayton, like, say we have a baseline that says you can have, like, normal volumes, no CSI volumes because those might be scary, and no NFS volumes because those might be scary, no privileged pods because those might be scary. So, okay, we've got a baseline policy. So then someone contributes a CSI volume plugin. They're like, I have a specific policy I want to implement around that. Well, now you need to punch a hole in your minimalist policy to let that through in order for the custom policy to, like, have opinions about it, or you have to completely replace the baseline. And so it's that ramp that I think we're struggling with for trying to do something in tree. That's all I had.
I think Tabitha's up next.
I like the way those two different concerns kind of mesh together. Because, like, to your point, Clayton, there's these plugins, and when people want to do something fancy for storage or networking, they use a plugin. But also note that Kubernetes ships basic versions of those plugins so that you can do something that's quote unquote not fancy and have it just work out of the box. And, similarly, that's how I would imagine in a future the relationship between pod security policy and gatekeeper being. Like, I'm arguing passionately in favor of pod security policy. I run gatekeeper in production, and I wouldn't stop doing that even if we did ship this pod security policy that I'm arguing for, because I think that people won't want to punch a hole in their simple policy in order to let something else handle one part of it. I think that, like your storage plugin or your networking plugin, people will decide, or ought to decide, when they're standing up a cluster, no, this one is fancy, we're going to use, say, gatekeeper in it. But then we're giving them an option, kind of similar to KubeNet, of if you don't have very fancy or specific needs, this one is simple and it's out of the box. I'm done.
Agreeing with Tabby, and just reiterating, like, from an end user standpoint, having worked at end user companies, having pen tested end user companies, having talked to a lot of end users who are not maintainers and who are not plugged into these conversations that are happening amongst ourselves, the biggest demand that I see and have seen for years is that there be some kind of security policy that has defaults that ship out of the box that are not just nothing, and that have like levels of, specifically people have asked for low, medium, high, that people can choose from how restrictive they want it to be, and then people can set it and forget it. And I think that, like, we have, I think arguably the biggest mistake that Kubernetes has made with security assumptions over the years is that people have assumed that users are, and in the beginning, I think this was true, like when everybody was a sysadmin who understood Linux primitives or whatever, and could configure these things really well according to how well they knew how to like turn the knobs and everything, they could do that. And as Kubernetes has gained bigger adoption, we are just throwing end users to the wolves. Like, they don't know what to do. They want to know what to do. People want to do the right thing. And right now we are just not giving them easy tools to be able to do that. And I think that if we ship something out of the box that has like different sets of suggested defaults that allows users to do that, I think we are actually empowering users to make it easier for them to make their stuff more secure. Because right now, again, if we're talking about cost, maybe we're lessening the cost for us, but the less that we are giving users in terms of tools for them to do this stuff, the more that we are offloading the costs onto these users who are really struggling with trying to figure out what they need.
Dims is next. For everyone who isn't aware, we're switching to hands in chat.
Yeah. Hi. So the only thing I can add to this discussion is the model that we have where kubeproxy, can be replaced by Cilium directly, right? So if we have, have we already talked about those that kind of a model where there is a default controller that does something basic, but then can be replaced by something that other people are writing.
I think to some extent we already have that today. That's sort of pod security policy. You can not use it and use an admission controller. Option 2 is saying, well, this is going to default to on, but there's nothing preventing you from, considering every namespace privileged from the purpose of that implementation, and again, falling back to third party. So I think that was kind of the point that David made, or I can't remember who, sorry, early on, that we have third party controllers and they're not going anywhere. The question is more, do we provide something in addition to that? And so I actually want to rename the option 3 to no default or no built-in. I also want to say, I'm looking at the time, and I don't think that we're going to make a decision here today. This conversation has gone similarly to past pod security policy discussions. And again, if we don't make a decision, the default is that we're going to end up with option 3 at 1.22 or 24 or whenever it actually goes away. So I would actually like to shift the discussion to ask how we can move forward on this. How do we come to some agreement here? What are the next steps? Should we start a working group? Should we keep discussing in SIG Auth?
Tabby and I have a
security
proposal.
offers to take it as well.
There does seem to be agreement that no matter what gets chosen, PSP is not the future that we see.
SIG security
SIG
has a
security
proposal.
thinks it's the fortune that we could see.
Yes, we do, and we would like to take it. That is what we are proposing.
Mo is next.
One of the things I wanted to ask on this concept of let's see, privilege, baseline, restricted, high, medium, low, whatever you want to call them. Does the Kubernetes project for a built-in thing have the capability of those things not being static? Right? Can we make a requirement that this API, when you say, like, if this thing existed, could we say that restricted means like restricted for like this version of this cluster, and if your app stops working on upgrade, sorry, you shouldn't have used restricted. Right? Like that's what restricted means. Same with baseline, right? Like if you could have such an API, is the biggest thing, which is the maintenance burden of this thing, go away, right? Because we could just keep tightening it, but like we don't have to like maintain indefinitely long, never-ending versions. And yeah, I don't know. Like it doesn't sound like the rest of Kubernetes because we like never break you basically, or we give you like years for like trivial things. So that would be my general concern of us making up the buckets, because the buckets are like never static in my mind, and we'll keep adding stuff to pods and they'll need more fancy restrictions, and the baseline will change, and now we have like 7 baselines. Like which baselines is the baseline? Right. But yeah, in my head, like you could have high, medium, you could have high, sorry, you could have low and medium and not actually have a high, because high is just audit, right? But that was just my thoughts. Who was after me? Tabitha, you're up.
When I raised my hand, it was because I wanted to put forth the proposal from SIG Security that we take over this bike shed, but that has now instead happened because I interrupted due to the fear that the discussion would go off in a direction where it no longer made sense to make that proposal.
But I actually think now would be the time for us to make that proposal. So maybe do that since your hand is up.
Okay, certainly. Yeah, like if SIG Auth is not happy with continuing to have this bike shed problem, then yeah, SIG Security formally proposes that we take this bike shed off of your hands. You know, perhaps by owning pod security policy.
Yeah, I think the issues raised with pod security policy are ones that we see as preventing it in its current form from moving forward. If there's, I would see it more of as a replacement. Like if there's a replacement in-tree proposal that is like option 2 or maybe option 1, like what would PSP v2 look like? Like if we fixed the things that have prevented it from getting adopted, that seems like a reasonable proposal to raise. But like, I don't think it's just a matter of like, we need to put more work in and then PSP can graduate.
I believe that we have verbally agreed upon a proposal that SIG Security has made that we have not had the opportunity to write yet because this came up right this minute and we are in a meeting rather than writing. I think my hand isn't up, but like, I think that is a thing that could be done, that a proposal could be made and put out that is written. It does not currently exist because we are having this conversation in real time.
I actually think I followed what you just said. I'm sorry.
People are like, if there was a written proposal for this, and I'm saying we could make a written proposal for this. We haven't written it because we're talking about it right now and have not had the chance to write it yet.
I think what Jordan was saying is the from SIG Auth, like is basically we carry this thing or we delete this thing. If you would like to replace or make new, sorry, if you would like to make new thing, we will happily look at KEP for a new thing.
Yeah, let me jump in there. Of course, anyone can make a proposal or KEP. It doesn't. There's no like, it has come from a SIG. I would be very happy for SIG Security to contribute or even own like definitions of what standard default policies should be. If we went with something closer to option 3, then I think that solidly falls in SIG Security's domain of providing guidance to the community of how to use third-party controllers. But if it comes to owning an in-tree pod security policy, I just wanted to point out that's explicitly out of the scope of SIG Security's charter. I don't want to start like a cross-SIG war here, but I do want to be careful about.
We could negotiate that if we needed to, but absolutely respect your boundaries.
I guess I do want to carry on one point from Jordan, which is that looking at the PSP API and the shortcomings that we found, I don't think that the future is built on evolving that API. I think that a lot of this presentation and the presentation that came before it and the one that came before that were all reasons to retire this API. And if a replacement comes along, that would be great. But I feel fair, I guess I'll speak for myself. I don't see this API evolving. And I don't know whether Jordan and Mo and Mike and Tim feel the same way or feel differently.
I gave up on PSP a long time ago.
So
I mean, it's not going to evolve if people don't want to evolve it, and fair enough. But I think that there are other folks who would like to evolve it.
This isn't a question of want, right? Like, this is a description of how the API works, and how that API, as it is today, is not workable. And
Go ahead.
And because that API is not workable and APIs in Kubernetes remain compatible across version boundaries, then I don't see semantic behavior change as an evolution that can happen.
Frankly, I see part of the problem here as sort of a lack of imagination, which makes sense for people who are sick of having this conversation after dealing with a broken API for a long time. And I have a lot of empathy for that. But I also think that, like, there are, you know, there is a certain extent to which I think, like, oh, well, this will never work. Not with that attitude, it won't. That, like, I think that, you know, the hybridized policies that were not entirely within the bounds of one or two were suggested. And I think people have ideas and excitement and energy around that. And I think that, like, if people are open to ideas and figuring out ways to make this work, I don't think it's undoable unless everybody poops on it and says that it'll never work.
No.
So I was going to ask, so, you know, I get the feeling that SIG security folks have a vested interest in this. Would it make sense? Like, I generally agree with David that I don't see PSP evolving. However, it's not that I don't see a new thing showing up, right? I would personally much more welcome an alpha API, like a KEP for an alpha API that starts over and does it right and hopefully addresses the problems without having to somehow carry PSP with it, right? If there is just this great desire to have this in tree, like, I feel like that's the way we go through it, right? Like, the KEP process has evolved immensely since PSP has existed. We have a much better understanding of how to build maintainable APIs in Kube. And we know everything we dislike about PSP, for sure. Like, I feel like that is much more likely to get traction if someone is willing to put in the effort to write the KEP or design or something. It doesn't have to be a KEP. It could just be a Google Doc where you necessarily come up with something, right? And, like, if it solves the problems that PSP has, like, I don't feel the need to carry PSP forward just because it was there, right? Like, right? Like, you could call it PSP v2 for all I care, but, like, but it doesn't have to, like, have any of the fields or anything like that, right? Like, to me, that seems like if you have time and effort, and if we were doing this all over again, that's what we would do, right? Like, if we went back and we knew everything we knew today, we wouldn't say probably that we don't want something internal, right? We would probably say we do, but like here's like the real good thing.
You're up, Tim.
Okay, since we're almost at time here, I want to talk a little about next steps. No, I absolutely agree with you about writing caps, even if it's sort of an informal draft cap. I think having some more concrete proposals will help us to carry this conversation forward. And so I encourage anyone who has some more concrete ideas about what's next to try and write those up. I think that we need to continue this conversation in SIG Auth, at least to the point where we can agree on another place to continue the conversation. With that, the next SIG Auth in 2 weeks is the day before Thanksgiving. I don't know how folks feel about meeting that week, or if we should cancel and go out 4 weeks. I'm also aware that there are 2 agenda items we didn't get to today, so I'd like to start with those next time.
I'm perfectly happy with canceling before Thanksgiving because pretty sure none of us will be here.
Okay, so let's say next. I'm just going to make an executive decision that next SIG Auth is canceled. We'll reconvene in 4 weeks to discuss next steps for the Client Go credential plugins and SPIFFE client certificate authentication, and also to pick up the pod security policy discussion. But I definitely see the PSP discussion carrying into the next year.
There was a proposal in chat for a KEP for PSP v2 Alpha API from folks working in SIG Security. SIG Security is up for it.
Great. Thank you.
Go for it. Like totally. Like you do not need our permission to write a KEP, ever.
And to be clear, we would like to see these problems solved. Tim and I spent a fair amount of time trying to figure out how to morph PSP into something that solved the problems. And I agree with Mo that like the shape of the existing API and maintaining compatibility with a thing that has a ton of problems, actually, I think made it harder to get to a good place. I think doing things side by side would make it much easier and faster, honestly, to get a thing which solves customers' problems and would give a really easy transition for like, if you're using PSP, keep it in place, start getting onto this new thing. But rebuilding the airplane in flight, I think will just waste a lot of energy keeping compatibility with the bad parts of PSP we wish we could drop.
Yeah, agreed. I don't think anybody liked any proposal that involved keeping compatibility.
Well, yeah. So that right there is the reason why I think PSP is not the future. And like the thing that solves these problems side by side in a good way is, I would love to see.
I think that was a conceptual problem of PSP the concept versus PSP the V1 API that we have to maintain compatibility with.
Okay.
Agreed.
Okay,
yeah, we like side by side too.
So I'm going to stop the conversation here. If you do write up a proposal, you absolutely do not need to wait until the next conversation in 4 weeks. Please send it out to the mailing list, and we can start having some more of the discussion on there. All right, thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a great next 4 weeks.
Thank you, everyone.